We have right over here Jimmy Himes, back with us, Bob Hodge. Both these guys have been with us since that first year. Way back in 2003 in Seymour was our first set. Right over there's Tyler Ivins, and we have, now Tyler was a new guy to our show just about a month ago. We have another new person today, Paige Dower. Paige, thanks for joining us.
Of course, thank you for having me.
And we'll talk a little bit about what you're doing here in a couple of segments from now, and what you and Jimmy are doing in terms of your production stuff, so we'll talk about that. Thanks for being here, we appreciate it. All right, when you look at the first section of Tennessee's football schedule, the first four games, it's basically August. You want to say September, but it's first game's August 31st. Then you got 3 in September before you hit the open date. Let's go ahead and put up the schedule so folks can see it. When you look at that and you're sitting there thinking, okay, to get to the playoffs, to feel good about earning a playoff berth, you're going to need to be 10-2. I mean, maybe somebody creeps in at 9-3, but I don't think you're going to feel good about your chances at that point. You're hoping. So to feel good about your chances, you need to be 10-2. My question is, you look at that schedule. If you need to be 10-2 to make the playoffs, does that kind of make it a must-win start by the time you leave September? Tyler, those first four games, if you're looking for the playoff, now granted, you could run the table the back end, but in terms of reality, realistically speaking, do you feel that's a must-win month if you're hoping for the playoffs?
100%. Yeah, and I think right there with that yellow line that you have marked there on the calendar, when you reach the first open date, if you're not 4-0, if you're not coming back from the SEC opener in Norman, Oklahoma, undefeated, you probably already have shot yourself in the foot of making the college football playoff. We've already talked about it off the air on radio shows when you've joined us here on the set. Tennessee's going to be underdogs in 3 of those 9 games. So one of those games is going to be that trip to Norman, Oklahoma. If 10-2 is the marker, and we already assume here, we were talking about some of those games earlier last Monday, Bama's also going to be a game that people look at and go, okay, can you play? Are those swing games for Tennessee? Georgia's clearly going to be a tough game. Before we got to this new calendar, I used to think that they did the schedule perfect. Great one big game in September against Florida, one big game against Alabama October, big game against Georgia November. This is similar to that schedule. You got to get through the checkpoint, first open date, you got to be 4-0 without question.
Next.
Oh, I'll throw out a question. I mean, if you lose to Oklahoma and beat Alabama, you're even. You're right back where you started. So is it a really big needed win? Yeah, I think it is. But must win, well, that'll be determined by what you do later.
But would you feel good about it if you lose to
I
Oklahoma?
wouldn't feel good.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't call it a must win, no doubt, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's
et
the
cetera.
irony of me asking this question, because on this show for years I've always said the only must-win game is the one that's truly must-win. You can always do something else. So, yes, if you could start 0-2 and then win your last 10, maybe you somehow finish 10-2 and get in.
But see, I could imagine a scenario where you could beat Alabama. I don't imagine a scenario where you go
0-2.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I don't know that I imagine a scenario. If you lose to Oklahoma, I don't know that you can. It's not only Alabama. That means you could lose on the road to Oklahoma, but you can't lose to anybody else the rest of the way. Yeah. Those last 8 games, you got to go 7-1 with a quarterback who's never started a full season. That I'm worried about. Paige, thoughts?
I think winning in Norman at Oklahoma sets the table for the rest of, especially the SEC conference. I think losing that game to Oklahoma puts a ton of pressure on the back half, or really the remaining part of the schedule, because you have a bye week and then you're on the road against Arkansas and then you have Florida. That's not going to be, a gimmick of a win, because I feel like Florida the last few years has had Tennessee's number. There's so many built-in storylines heading into that Oklahoma matchup that I think you just have to win that game. Obviously, it's his former team. He coached there, led them to national title, runner-up in the Heisman. I think because of all of those storylines, you have to go and win that game.
Jimmy?
If you don't beat Oklahoma, I question whether you can beat Alabama. I wonder if your team's good enough to do that. So if you don't sweep, and I can't eliminate NC State.
Right.
North Carolina State's projected by some to win 10 games. It's a pretty good football team.
Yeah.
But if you lose one of those 2, I don't know that you can go 7-1 after that. So I would reduce it to less than 30% to make the college football playoff if you lose one of those 2 games.
Oh, I'd reduce it by even more than that.
25%.
We'll get into later on where I stand on the big picture.
So I think it makes it very difficult to get there if you lose one of those games. Now, we don't know how good Alabama's going to be. We're guessing.
Right,
That's a lot of guesswork.
But all of this is. We're guessing how good Tennessee's going to be.
Oklahoma. I mean, they lost all of their offensive linemen. They got all of it from the portal. How good will Oklahoma really be? I mean, you look to last year, they had a top 50 strength of schedule. It ended up being a top 14 strength of record. So they could end up being a much better team, and so could all the other teams. But understanding what they've lost, what they're replacing, I feel like you have to win because of that.
Well,
Here's your weekly
my point
reminder.
about Alabama is that there are more question marks about them now than there have been.
Yes.
Right?
Well,
Because
new
you don't
coach,
have Saban.
yeah.
You've lost 40 people in the portal. So that's why I'm saying we don't know what Alabama's going to be like.
Here's your weekly reminder about they can lose, but the ease of Ole Miss and Missouri's records this year, or excuse me, their schedules this year. A lot of people are anticipating, you've already touched on win totals, which we'll get into later. Their win totals aren't dropping. So you got to get as many wins as possible and collect as much as you can before you get to pivotal games in October and November.
Yeah, now realistically, if we get into this thing and Tennessee loses to NC State or Oklahoma, I'm going to say the same thing I said a few years ago when they lost to Georgia State. It's like the season isn't over. I mean, you lose to Georgia State, you lose to BYU, you start 0-2, and you finish to 8-4, and it was or 8-5. It was the longest win streak in the country outside of LSU. If you remember, I was beating that drum. And you can turn those things around. I just don't like the odds of being backed against the wall going into the SEC. You would have played one SEC game, and now you can only afford to lose one more.
No,
That's tough
I don't like the odds either.
Yeah, because
I mean, I think if you go to Norman and lose, there's a lot of things off the table.
or NC State,
Or NC State. I just think that, if you have one loss in September, you still have a lot to play for going forward instead of, it's over, we're done.
Well, this is the interesting thing because there's always some number. If you got 4 teams in, then you can only lose 1 game. If there's 12 teams in, it's going to be interesting to see what the records are of the teams that make that playoff. We're all assuming right now, I said it, well, you're going to have to be 10-2 probably to feel good about it.
Right.
I mean, who knows? Maybe some 8-4 team slips in. Maybe it's the year of parity in college football. We don't know yet, but it is going to be interesting to see how that impacts schedules from here on out. If you're sitting there and everybody is now aimed at the 12-team playoff, and you lose too early, and let's say they lose to NC State and Oklahoma, then we're done. You're done. You're not going to go through Alabama and Georgia and the rest of the SEC. What does that do to your season? Because in the past, you could still finish okay, get on a run, be on the second longest winning streak to LSU that they did a couple. You could do that, and people would still get kind of charged up. If you've taken the playoff off the table, I wonder what that's going to do to a season. It's a new change, a new dynamic in college football.
I think when you have high expectations, then when you lose 2 games like that, it's harder. Because now the players are like, hey, where's the season going to go?
Yeah.
If you're projected to win 6 or 7 games and you lose 2, you still feel, we got something to play for. So I think that takes a lot of the intensity away from this football team if they lose 2 games early because your expectations are probably not going to be met.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Because I think when you can group it into your months or your groups of 4 throughout the season, this first 4 games, this first month, you have no room for error. You look at, later in the season when you've got a Florida in that month, an Alabama in that month, or even a Georgia in that month, you got a little bit more room for error because of the caliber team that you're playing. September, August, that's like your only month where you need to be perfect.
But if you set it up that way, that you have no room for error, and then you err, then does your team tank like Jimmy said? Now, we erred. We're done.
You don't want to be the team that erred. But any of those teams, and this goes for all these teams, when I say it'll be interesting to see how teams handle it, not just Tennessee. If a team starts with 2 losses early and their whole goal is the playoff, sure, you can still make it, but the odds are against anybody doing that. Does that team tank? And here's another thing to think about it. Let's say you've got some NFL first-round guy.
Bingo.
Who says, we're not making the playoff? Oh, I pulled a hammy. I'm going to sit this season out and take care of my pro prospects. Or somebody says, I'm going to hit the portal. You don't know. It's a different day and age. So, all right, when we come back, we've got a new topic for you we're going to play today. It's called More or Less. Are you more confident in Nico or less confident in secondary? We got questions like that coming up. Come on back on The Sports Source.